Arc 3 is about as close to a nothing game as you can get, in the sense that absolutely nothing happened. Characters don't grow or progress, they face minimal adversity, and the story is the discarded musky remnants of what was once an anime plot. The combat is almost unnecessary, as random mobs are a bad joke, and bosses aren't much funnier. If I had to slap a sales pitch on the back of the box, I'd say they're not paying me enough for this shit, but they are paying me, 7 out of 10. Outside of some cathartic venting, there won't be much to this video, as the gameplay has less to it than the prior entries, and the story's a handful of sporadic recycled plot points. Anything positive I could say, I've already said it better in my previous 2 videos, so sorry in advance. I was immediately suspicious when I noticed 3D children in the opening cinematic. I won't get into how having a band of happy-go-lucky teens is a major red flag for a JRPG, but when viewed in contrast to the former titles, it was clearly chasing a new tale. Arc 1 and 2 both featured pre-rendered FMVs, however the characters never appear as hyper-polygonized 3D models. The only time I can even recall them showing up in cutscenes was when they overlaid the 2D sprites, and as far as I can recall, that only happened once. They've always been more of a spectacle of gears, showcasing the machinery which powers this bizarre world. It's kinda charming, possibly alluding to a fetish for all things technological over at Arc Studios, or maybe it was just easier to model things that didn't have human characteristics, like existential despair.
At the time of the release of Arc number 2, character animations were possible, but there were a number of restrictions. For example, from the point of view involving hardware, we couldn't do the characters. But with Arc the Lad number 3, there was an abundance of software applications available. And there were some new software programs that were suitable for character-type animations. At the beginning, we didn't think about putting the characters in the CG movie segments. We created one as an experiment, and it was received so well that we decided to follow this course of inserting these characters into the movie segments.
That said, the characters in the third game's FMVs actually don't look too bad, which is consistent with the rest of the game's visuals, as they've received quite a heavy makeover. Instead of being solely sprite-based, the terrain is now 3D, and the 2D elements are left for the inhabitants of the world. This was a pretty common trend towards the end of the PlayStation's life cycle, with games such as Breath of Fire's 3 and 4, Grandia, and Final Fantasy Tactics utilizing their own variants of the same style. Could it be that Arc 3 was attempting to break out of the firmly taped box by mimicking a hot trend? I mean, anything's possible, but a much easier way to do that would have been to make a good game. The reworked sprites are pretty solid with a more elongated, humanly proportioned look, and I was always curious to see what the old characters looked like in the new style, but it fell into the well-established trap of rejecting stylization for attempted modernization. Retroactively speaking. Finding a simple style that translates well to the medium can be the difference between your game consistently looking great in spite of the destructive force of time, and looking like a boxed lunch from 2 decades ago. I'm not saying any of this to shit on Arc 3, but there's something special about the first 2 titles, which is entirely absent in the third, and a large part of that is the presentation. The small beans ooh-woo in the first 2 are visually distinct, and it doesn't look like much else on the system, where Arc 3, despite looking pretty good, also feels a bit generic. While we're still kinda talking about cutscenes, the initial one in Arc 3 begins by showing the aftermath of the final battle from the former game, and the complete destruction of a city, in which we find our new fella, Alec. A mysterious hunter saves him moments before certain death and ships the orphan off to a better life. As the wagon pulls away, his bewildered face is cross-faded with that of the present-day Alec as he becomes visibly inspired by the vivid memory. The abridged visual elements convey a rough backstory without requiring hordes of text or exposition, and lands us exactly where the game begins. The narrative takes place in the ashes of the former world, where after the destruction caused by the Dark One, humanity is tasked with cleaning up their shit and getting on with it. One of the highest pieces of praise I gave Arc 2 was that despite beating the big bad evil man, the world was still destroyed, and the ending really played this up, so naturally as Arc 3 confronts this reality, it should bring about some amazing scenarios that deal with the dark, raw human moments.
Lamau.
Alec is a level-headed teen who hangs out with his equally orphaned buddy Lutz, presumably doing, whatever orphan kids do in small villages, being exploited by billionaires to mine lithium for car batteries or, climbing trees, I guess. Shortly after they're introduced, they hear shots fired from the village, and upon returning, find that bandits have taken control. Surprisingly, the standard JRPG approach is avoided, where a couple kids had beat the shit out of grown men with guns. Instead, the orphans get put in their place and cower before their new captors, lamenting over their skinny noodle arms. The first mission involves sneaking away from the town, hiring a hunter from the Hunters Guild, and having a real man protect the village. Immediately after this, the hunter woos Lutz's sister, then the boys decide to become hunters, presumably so they too can lay the smackdown on Lutz's sister. It's at this point where the horrendously shit narrative takes over from an otherwise pretty solid setup. Nothing makes you want to progress a story more than playing as some disgustingly weak soy blob as he accelerates toward his redemption run, but the Bandit Village saga is the last point where they face any kind of struggle. Alec waddles into the Hunters Guild, asked to become a hunter, and they practically trip over themselves handing him a badge, and then everyone clapped and gave him $20. It would have been far more interesting to see Alec struggle for his hunter title, with a bigger focus on the events leading up to the attainment and a grander narrative unfolding and intertwining as a result. From here, the game becomes a monotonous sequence of mostly shitty fetch quests with a sprinkling of plot on top, which speaks of a secret organisation who wishes to restore the glory of humanity through kidnapping, browbeating, and a lot of fleeing from our prepubescent party. Every important scene with this group consists of vague talking about nothing before they escape and hide behind another 20 or so fetch quests. Honestly, the back half of Arc 2 looks like a fucking narrative masterpiece in comparison to this shit. At least towers exploding was fun in a chimp brain sort of way. The evil bad boys are eventually caught up with, and they revive the plot from the last game. Then the group of 16-year-olds destroys the ultimate evil forever, despite both Ark and Elk only being able to seal him, and that near-impossible task coming with some heavy casualties and that people died and the world was completely ruined. Again, because of the lack of consequence or pushback toward Alec and his crew, only 2 people die and they're both evildoers, and both perish at the hands of the young protagonist. The big twist of the story is that one of the evil henchmen was the hunter who saved Alec in the opening cutscene, but he turned evil because I don't really care, and Alec kills him because he's evil. It's a shit attempt at a twist, not to mention the 2 brave soldiers who throw their lives away to further their boss's ideals were completely wasted deaths. Not 10 minutes after these fights, the boss abandons the plan and says it was a stupid idea all along, and then he rides off into the sunset with a science MILF. There was a second attempt at a twist, but it's more retarded horseshit than a real plot point. The Hunters Guild is a believable entity in the world where destroyed societies are rebuilding and monsters are on the loose. At no point would a player question its existence in this fresh hellscape, especially given the opening scenes with the bandits in the village. However, the devs were so desperate to justify its existence and heavy-handed integration into the story that they turned it into a shadow government who have been monitoring the bad guys and were looking for a group of strong anime children to deal with all their problems. Most of the characters from the first 2 games are still alive. I don't understand why they needed to wait for Alec to roll on up with his clown bestie, 2 females, a literal baby, and a Sephiroth cosplayer when they could have just asked, I don't know, Elk or Tosh, someone competent, some experienced individuals to deal with the problem. Speaking of, their presence isn't handled very well either. Every old character warms up to Alec immediately and decides to help him because Alec's really cool and he's a strong and caring radical dude. Rumours about Tosh being a hard ass pop up quite a bit, but nah man, he fucking loves Alec. Alec's great, unlike our buddy Chongara, who's now homeless and crazy. I don't get why Arc 3 exists, but it definitely shouldn't. And that's the entire story. We never see Alec frost Lut's sister like a cake, but we know deep down that he, and many others, almost certainly did. A majority of events are contained within 100 mostly optional hunter missions, but they almost entirely consist of petty NPC drama and meaningless busy work. Alec's core motivation was becoming not just a hunter, but a legendary one, so to justify that, the game allowed you to rise through the ranks of the Hunters Guild, but it serves no purpose. The wanted monsters also return, but again, there's no need to interact with them because there's no reward. The points you get aren't used for anything. Some sub-stories take place over multiple encounters, and these are okay. The familiarity of the characters and scenarios found within makes them marginally more enjoyable, but there are only a handful of quests that actually stuck with me, and I'd attribute this mostly to the lack of dark themes. You'd think in a destroyed world you'd have a lot more human moments, but the only one I genuinely remember was when a mother who had lost her son wished to track down his spear. The party initially gets the wrong spear, and I was expecting her to have impaled herself on it by the time they corrected their mistake. Eventually, they find the right spear and she forgets her depression entirely. The ending's downplayed in that it could have delved a bit deeper into the depths of despair, but it's also kind of touching as she remarks that the party remind her of her son. I got to the point where I was so disappointed by how not dark this supposedly apocalyptic world was that I kept wishing people would die just so that something happened. When it comes to side quests, what can you really offer other than kill Y, collect X, or a stupid forced minigame? Luckily for us, in addition to the abundance of X and Y, Arc 3 also features a handful of weird minigames, and they are a much needed pace breaker. There's one where you've got to shoot some homosexuals before they convert you, as they approach from the 4 primary directions at varying speeds. Another one features a library detective case where you need to piece together clues to discover the real book murderer, and they're not deep, but are different enough in a game packed full of generic shit. It's a shell of what Arc 2 delivered, like the best parts were carelessly copied and fingers were carelessly crossed. The major distinction being that even if half of Arc 2 was garbage, it had an actual story, and the side quests were just the cream that rose to the top. Arc 3 has no story, and the cream's fucking spoiled. Dialogue's not much help either, and the quality's questionable even for working designs, who took on the task of translating all 3 titles plus Monster Tournament and the bonus disc within the span of 1 year. If I had to guess based on the quality alone, I'd say they ordered them linearly, with Arc 3 getting the least amount of time. Characters constantly and painstakingly break from their believable selves to become vessels for horrible dad jokes that someone was clearly proud of. It genuinely comes across as though I'm being made fun of for having bought the game. Like, did you really need a crack house joke in a universe where I'm fairly certain crack doesn't exist?
I believe I took on our collection because I had a temporary bout of insanity.
There's a questline with an implied group of homo bros where Lutz says something to the effect of, "I thought I smelled a fruit." This isn't something I take issue with because I'm not an uppity loser with no sense of humour, but the dialogue does kind of rip you from the experience. There's also a part with a transvestite propositioning teenage boys, and the dialogue in those scenes would institutionalise some social media users. Luckily for Arc Studios, people who get preachy about that shit really only whinge about popular games, so Arc is safe. Until the remakes. I still think the edgy comments peaked in Arc 2, when a rich white dude straight up questioned how much grey matter a black guy had, but one man's PR nightmare is another man's good time. It's entirely possible that the Japanese dialogue saves the character interactions in Arc 3, but that's the least of the game's worries. Most JRPG developers seem to understand that bogging the player in the same area for too long will rapidly increase the burnout rate, so town visits are rarely more than a quick stop in, gear up, chinwag, and bail. If you're hovering in town for an extended period, you're very likely reading dialogue and not doing anything fun. Another flaw of Arc III is that the Hunters Guild requires check-ins per quest acceptance and completion, so each town becomes an obnoxiously retreaded hub. And the layout of each place is so samey as they're effectively interchangeable. Arriving in a new area rarely feels like you're somewhere new. It exists as a place to get more shitty quests from, made even worse as you can only accept 3 at a time, which was fine in Arc 2, but that's because the quests weren't complete dogshit. Plenty of RPG towns feel samey as there's a certain guaranteed utility you expect from arriving at one, but due to the rate they're accessed in Arc, it becomes infinitely more noticeable. It's convenient in that I don't have to make a continental trek to buy a sword, but that's a minor positive on the back of the fact that every area feels the same to a crippling degree. With this new iteration, a great opportunity was afforded to the team to make combat not a horrendously slow, often pointless mess, and based on the changes, they'd clearly taken a critical eye to the former games. Combat's had a few refinements, such as being able to automatically select your party, but you still have to confirm them on the pre-combat screen and then wait for it to load. This seems like a pointless addition. Why wouldn't you skip character selection entirely while the option's active and then automatically deselect it when there's a roster change? It would save quite a bit of time, not unlike the combat and level up speed sliders, which are nice additions but don't do much to make encounters any more tolerable. Enemies no longer play a coin-shitting animation upon death, and some even die in tandem, so there was an attempt at streamlining the whole process. As the roster's been severely reduced, only 4 members are allowed into battle now, which makes the skirmishes much shorter, but they're still slow. Monster wrangling was subbed out for a new mechanic called Cardish. This ability is similar to a summoner in a more conventional JRPG, where powerful monsters are called upon, but instead of chanting for mythical beasts from other dimensions, almost any monster in the game can be captured in a card, and turned into an expendable attack or support effect. Card capting has a great utility. Not only does sealing a monster remove a single enemy from play, but cards also carry over and can be hoarded for as long as you like, with the ability to carry 5 at once, which is beyond fair because they are stupidly overpowered. I much preferred this to Lisa's monster capture abilities, as the roster was already so large it was hard to find the time to actually use your enslaved beasts. But with Cardish, I get to experience all these neat summon effects without sacrificing the experience of my core team or trying to juggle an equitable use of characters. Magic levels are also permanent upgrades, so there's no selecting between tiers to reduce MP use or increase damage, which was an interesting choice. It doesn't really matter, as you'll always want to do the maximum damage, and most enemies are wiped with a few hits anyway, but it does suck for secondary effects such as status ailments, which are barely seen as enemies simply die too quickly. Dungeons themselves are similar to the previous title in that any new room has a likely chance of containing an encounter, and they're moved about at a slow enough pace to pray you never have to return. As there are so many side quests and so few areas to explore, plenty of them do require multiple retreads, and they were honestly the worst part of the game. A quest where you talk to someone, fight a guy, and then hand it in, as shallow as they were, are far superior to hour-long dungeons full of bloated combat, which is so intrusive they rival random encounters. Not to mention Alec's unnecessary movement when starting quests, such as being asked to follow a guy to speak in private, both characters moving 2 spaces to the right and then having a conversation. Many times after accepting a quest, Alec will automatically walk out of the room, or when the party's involved, they'll do the same one by one. It's really just burning precious seconds when I don't need to see characters walking. It's not important, just fade to black. What actually saves you precious seconds is the arena, which is a 1v1 battle wherein you wager an item, your opponent raises you, and you duke it out for some trinkets. For the most part, rewards are garbage, but in the early game, the arena actually serves as a quick way to get some great gear. Up until a certain point, it's a weapon increment system, where if you stake a weapon or armor, you'll be rewarded with the enhanced version. You know, looking back now, that might have contributed to the fact that the game was super fucking easy. But you know what, it's not my fault, don't make your game incredibly exploitable. The roster features many temporary characters, but as they only stick around for a few battles or a dungeon at most, they're more experience leeches than anything. Sure, having Tosh and Elk in your party's cool and all, but unfortunately they aren't permanent additions. I just want to go back to Arc 2, just let me go back, please. So that's Arc 3. The beginning set me up for an experience the game didn't even get close to delivering, and it ended up being one of the worst JRPGs I've ever played, because it's so fucking boring. Some neat ideas were sprinkled throughout, but an otherwise nothing experience. It's alright, Arc's getting a bit stale anyway. I think the series needs a hard reboot, you know, really kickstart its future, breathe some life back into it. Here's a fucking concept, right? What if we took half the story from Devil May Cry, but instead of making it about really cool twinks, we made it about racist twinks? Nah, that's fucking stupid, they'd never do that.